it's it's like that. It's like glitter, right? You think you get rid of glitter, but you never get rid of glitter. Hello, my name is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, getter of buckets. This is the Who Cares What Todd Thinks vlog. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. What are we talking about today? We are talking about the near ubiquitous critical race theory in kind of a roundabout way. We're going to talk about all the ways where it shows up in places that we don't expect it. That's what it means for something to be ubiquitous. It's like everywhere, right? It's like that. It's like glitter, right? You think you get rid of glitter, but you never get rid of glitter. You come in contact with glitter, and like a year later, you find it in weird places. So this is basically critical race theory is like the glitter of ideology, so to speak. All right. So listen, we're gonna look at a talk from the big homie Flame 413 314. I always get that wrong. He's from St. Louis. That's his area code. Flame 314, and also the big homie, The Truth. And they have obviously a vlog that they do on YouTube called Complicated Ish. And I tune in. They have some interesting perspectives, and I really respect both of these guys a lot. But today, just keeping it all the way 100, there will be critiques. Okay, I'm just going to say that there will be critiques. Like I said, I respect these brothers, but I'm surprised at some of the ways in which, once again, CRT tends to show up, and I know that's a controversial subject. That's a controversial term because it's almost like it's not that far off to many people than accusing people of heresy, and I don't think that it's necessarily in that category. Obviously, I'm not accusing these brothers of espousing heresy, but listen, it is what it is, man. We're just going to deal with it because that's the only way you can ever get past, differences and making sure you're just putting all your cards on the table. That's what we're going to do today. So, in this video that Flame and Truth are talking, they're talking about really Calvinism. They said, did Calvinism help or hurt Christian rap? Now, interestingly enough, you would think that has nothing to do with CRT, but in this particular talk, they delve into kind of, because in the Christian rap circles, there was a large kind of embrace by the evangelical church, kind of the white evangelical church, because in America, to be quite frank, in a lot of black churches, they just weren't really feeling the Christian rap thing, and so a lot of traction was gained in the white evangelical church, and in those circles, Calvinism is a very prominent kind of I guess brand, for lack of a better term, of doctrine in Christianity, and a lot of the Christian rappers embraced that Calvinistic thought. But obviously, hip hop or rap is a black art form. It's black culture in a sense. So they start to go down the inevitable line of race and issues of race, and that's where we find ourselves kind of stumbling on CRT. So what we're going to do is we're going to let the big homie Flame talk. We're going to listen to him, and then we're going to respond, and we're going to see where the conversation goes. Let's listen to the conversation. Now, I should say I'm going to start this at about 9 minutes and 30 seconds. I really encourage you to go watch the whole thing for yourself. Watch the whole thing in context, because even before this, they make some very interesting points and some things that I can respect and agree with. But this is where I think kind of the meat of the conversation goes. And so let's take a listen.
I want to call it movement. I think of, for example, when a lot of this, at least in our generation, really hit the fan with Trayvon Martin and then Mike Brown, right? So that's sort of like probably the marker of when the church started to think a little deeper about these things, right?
Yeah.
Because really, from the civil rights movement to like right up to like Trayvon,
Yeah.
the church hadn't really talked much about social justice or social injustice. It was pretty much, you know, if you were in a prosperity driven church, you were talking about prosperity. If you were in a reform driven church, you were talking about doctrines of grace and so on and so forth. But then this social
Well, there
conversation.
were black liberation.
Right. So there were churches then that were, but it was pockets. It wasn't like a big conversation.
Of course. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I'm just saying, in everybody's respective corners, they were sort of
talking about
So
them.
we're just going to pause it right there because I think this deserves some exploration. So just to kind of catch you up, obviously, he's talking about now we're getting into the social justice aspect and how the church dealt with issues of social justice and how that manifested, once again, in different cultural contexts. So obviously, Calvinism, white evangelical churches was where that idea and that doctrine is prevalent. But this is the first problem that I had right away with kind of the way that this conversation went, because here Flame kind of, uses as a marker, and I think appropriately so. He mentions Trayvon Martin, which had happened, maybe a year or so before the Michael Brown situation. But then he mentions Michael Brown and Ferguson, and I have to say that this to me is disappointing because he kind of mentions it as kind of like this, well, with no further explanation, no caveats, like, hey, the whole Michael Brown situation in Ferguson was an example of a situation that needed to be responded to with, a cry for social justice. Now, I use the Michael Brown situation like a litmus test, to be quite frank. Whenever someone says the Michael Brown situation is an example of social injustice, I'm just keeping it all the way 100. I immediately know that this person may not be well informed. They might be talking about these things, but in a way where they just lack the basic knowledge to really have a conversation that is meaningful. What's really more kind of disappointing about this particular reference from Flame is because Flame is from St. Louis, right? And Ferguson, Missouri is basically, that's the same community. Now, I don't know the exact geography of St. Louis and Ferguson, Missouri, whether that's like a suburb or whether it's down the street. Like, I live in Omaha, Nebraska, and there's a town called Bellevue that's 25 minutes away, and whatever. I don't know how close they are, but that's his community. And so I really almost expect him to be more informed than the average person about this. And here he mentions it like it was an example of social injustice. And so you'll see why this is important to me here in a moment. But I want to let's just talk about the Michael Brown situation just for a moment. I want to read you an article that is in the Washington Post. You can't read all the Washington Post articles for free. Sometimes you have to have a description. But here's one that I think kind of says everything we need to know. It says, "Hands up, don't shoot did not happen in Ferguson." That's an interesting headline, right? Let's read it. This phrase became a rallying cry for Ferguson residents who took to the streets to protest the fatal shooting of black 18-year-old by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. Witness accounts spread after the shooting that Brown had his hands raised in surrender, mouthing the words, "Don't shoot," as his last words before being shot execution style. The gesture of raised hands becomes a symbol of outrage over mistreatment of unarmed black youth by police. That narrative was called into question when St. Louis County grand jury could not confirm those testimonies, and a recently released Department of Justice investigation report concluded the same. Yet the gesture continues to be used today. Here's the critical point. So we want to set the record straight on the DOJ's findings, especially after the Washington Post opinion writer Jonathan Capehart wrote that it was built on a lie. From time to time, we retroactively check statements as new information becomes available, and in this case, the Justice Department has concluded that Wilson acted out of self-defense and was justified in killing Brown. Now, for more context, this is the Washington Post, okay? This isn't Fox News or whatever sort of caricature of right-wing news sources that want to dismiss all the racism as if it's just regular and necessary. This is the Washington Post. In fact, the Washington Post is actually a news source that actually compiles, and they actually have an ongoing database where they document every police shooting of an unarmed person, particularly unarmed black people, but an unarmed person, in an effort to kind of try to demonstrate the scope of the problem. So they're big on the social justice thing, on the unarmed black men being shot thing. They are not. This is not whatever right-wing news source you think is racist. They're saying unequivocally that the hands up, don't shoot thing was a lie. And here's the thing about this. Hands up, don't shoot. I've known that this was a lie for years, right? Hands up, don't shoot. That happened in 2014. We're 2021. And this podcast that Flame released, I'm spending a lot of time on this because I want you to understand why this is important. This is 2021, and Flame is still using this as an example of social injustice. And this is the reason why we cannot come to a unified vision of what it means to pursue justice. It's because we have people who consistently use false information and false narratives as examples of injustice, and then when people don't respond to them in the way that they hope, as we'll see later in the video, now all of a sudden the persons who are not responding that way, they're responding with a lack of compassion and being calloused. So this is the first and most critical error, and I think it sets the tone for me, and this is where it started to change for me as I listened to this video. And then I listened to some of the other things that they say, and I can see right away that all of the rhetoric that tends to permeate our speech and starts to creep in and take on sort of Christian forms, it starts to get us going down the wrong path. So that's the first thing I wanted to address. Let's listen a little bit more to this.
Everybody's respective corners, they were sort of
talking about their thing.
Talking about their thing.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So but you do right to bring it up, because churches have been, a lot of people have been on this.
Yeah.
Before it was kind of like,
and they were demonized. This
right.
is to your point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
We called it social gospel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Black liberation theology.
Yes.
We labeled it something that had a negative slant on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And then you get the Trayvon and unfortunate situation, and then the Mike Brown unfortunate situation, and the church now is thinking, how are we going to respond? What are we going to say? And my point of bringing that up is to say, I think as a collective conscience, not that there weren't Christian rap artists who had been informed and knew what to say, but collectively, it seems like our sentiments for engaging social justice were very weak.
Yeah.
The reflex, that muscle was sort of unexercised.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christian artists or young Christians in general, or churches, pastors alike, were kind of stumped. Like, what do we say? How does the church respond? I remember in St. Louis, a lot of churches started to come together from across the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. Black.
I just want to pause it right here and interject once again. He talks about, in effect, the muscle of responding to social justice issues in the church being, in effect, sort of atrophied, right? That the response from the church was weak. Once again, to reemphasize what I've kind of said before, the facts of the matter were not established that this was actually a social justice issue, right? You know, when we talk about social justice, when there's a justified police shooting, then that's not a social justice issue. I think the hesitancy of the church and many churches to respond was that it wasn't clear that this was an injustice. And so what he attributes to maybe apathy or maybe like an atrophied muscle of, you know, having a readiness to respond to social injustice is really just an uncertainty about what we're actually experiencing. And so I just wanted to interject that. Let's listen a little bit more.
White, brown, and that was the main question. And I remember sort of asking that same question and being taken back that so many of us didn't know what to say.
We had to ask that question.
The fact that we had
to ask
that
question.
You feel me? The fact that we even had to ask was sort of telling as to where our priorities have been.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And I think the thing that's unique and unfortunate about that is in a civil rights space, the black church understood that pretty well.
Absolutely.
Right. Before we move on, I don't want this point to be lost because I just want to set the tone here. Notice that in this segment here, Truth mentions fairly clearly something called Black liberation theology, and this is where if I may say, the conversation gets really, really spicy. Okay, we're going to circle back to that. I just wanted to. Because he mentioned it twice, actually. He mentioned liberation theology, and then he came back and said Black liberation theology, and then he said, oh, yeah, but it was demonized. So I just want you to keep that in your mind because it was demonized for good reason. But let's listen.
Would we have maintained that had we understood better, you know, the risk of abandoning those cultural reflexes, right? I think, and I'm using Reform theology on purpose because that became the dominant theological sway on Christian rap. I mean, anybody that's honest will have to admit that.
Yeah,
I think what came with that was a prioritization of European Reformation influence on young black thinkers.
Okay. Now, this is where it all starts to coalesce. Here we have a reference to white evangelicalism and, you know, European. Here he says it again, which is basically a euphemism for white people, right? You know, we've abandoned sort of our cultural reflexes. We are in this is the implication, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but we aren't sensitive to racial injustice because we were around white people too long. I mean, I hope that's not too forward, but that's what I'm gathering. So I just want to address this concept here, and and this is why I said, you wondering why maybe what the connection was when I initially said we're going to talk about critical race theory. You said, well, wait a minute. The topic of this video here is, did Calvinism hurt or help Christian rap? It's just like, you're talking about critical race theory, you're talking about Calvinism. It's like, no, this video really is about race. But I want to address this thing that they're kind of alluding to, and then we're going to take a deeper dive. What really is interesting to me is this concept that somehow your cultural or your background or your experiential perspective, what some might call viewpoint epistemology or something like that, is somehow necessary in order for you to grasp fully the issues of justice. Let's just think about this for a moment. Do you know that when, for example, black people were freed, when freed from slavery, that there wasn't a single black person who voted or who decided to move forward with the Civil War in order to accomplish that? So here's an interesting question. If white people somehow can't really understand and fully comprehend issues of justice, then where did, say, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln and all the other people and the abolitionists of the 17th and 18th centuries, where did they get their sensibilities from? Did they have some experiential knowledge of oppression? Did they have a viewpoint epistemology that allowed them to come to the conclusion that black people were being treated unfairly? And the answer to that is, of course not. That's a the idea that arriving at that ultimate truth is somehow rooted in your personal subjective experience is, to me, it's I think empirically not true, as I just pointed out clear examples of where virtually all of the oppressors or the oppression that was relieved by the oppressor, in a sense, right? So where did they get their sensibilities from? Every woman who ever got a chance to vote was given the chance to vote by men, right? Because there's something about human beings, because we are social creatures, we have the ability to empathize, and because justice is an objective truth issue, it's not a subjective issue. Everyone has the capacity to understand the suffering of another human being, whether you've experienced that directly or not. We have that capacity. And so the thing that troubles me a little bit about this is it's almost suggesting a viewpoint epistemology. And so on that note, we're going to take a look at a gentleman named Neil Shenvi. Neil Shenvi is a great resource, kind of a self-taught expert on critical race theory. And he's talking with a guy named Rasul Berry about this issue. And I want you to see, once again, why I say that critical race theory is ubiquitous, whether we realize it or not. Let's listen to him talk about this.
So critical theorists are actually not postmodernists in a radical sense. They believe truth is out there, but they believe that oppressed people have special access to that truth. So when she says, I want to decolonize my bookshelf, think how weird it would sound to say, I need to decolonize my math book or my science textbooks. I need to decolonize those. No, you don't. Why? Well, because those are objectively true. Well, wait, are your Bible commentaries not? That's the question. So,
Right.
What does she mean exactly? So,
Well,
I'm not saying clearly we can get a lot.
I'd love to hear Rasul's response to this, because this,
So,
I think, is key.
I want you to understand what he's talking about here. He's making the point that critical race theorists, one of the key aspects of their ideology is what we would classify as viewpoint epistemology. They're, like he said, they're not postmodernists in the sense where they don't think there's any objective truth, but they often use these terms like, well, my lived experience is what gives me the ideas that I have, and you need to lean forward and listen instead of trying to justify your racism, because apparently all white people are racist, and this is a core tenet of critical race theory. But the main thing is that this viewpoint, right, that oppressed people have special access to the truth here. Let's listen to one other clip really quick.
So Muslim Christians say, well, okay, I see that that's a problem. A lot of critical race theorists say that that's central to their discipline, that seeing sex, gender, race, class as all intertwined, that's important to them, but I have to reject that as a Christian. I'll just use it to view race, okay? Well, here's the problem there. They even get race really wrong. Another big, huge conflict is in their view of epistemology, how you know the truth. So again, one of their core tenets is that racism hides behind claims of objectivity and colorblindness. And to really understand racism, we have to listen to the lived experience of people of color, right? And, well, what does that do? If you really believe that, what do you do when someone says to you that your gospel is not the real gospel? That what you believe is this truncated, individualistic, white evangelical gospel. For example, in his book, Reconstructing the Gospel, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove writes, the gospel of white evangelicals hasn't interrupted our racial habits, it's reinforced them. In America, racial politics has always been Christian. Co-opting the poor refugee Christ to defend white supremacy. We miss the basic message of the gospel. It goes on and on about how we all have embraced slaveholder religion. Now, if you're a white person, now he's white, interestingly, but if you're a white person, how do you respond to that claim that you don't know the gospel? Well, if you say, well, but the Bible says this, they'll say that's your white European Western interpretation of the Bible. You're blinded by your white privilege. And so, but no, my interpretation is objectively true. Well, that's objectivity is a cloak for racism and white supremacy. What if you're a person of color? Like I'm half Indian. What if I say, wait a minute, that's not true. The gospel I believe really is the gospel the Bible teaches. Well, in that case, critical race theorists will say that I have internalized oppression. I've imbibed white evangelicalism, and so I'm just parroting back their talking points. So there's no way to answer them.
This is an important point that Neil is making here. And I want to take a second here to acknowledge that, some people are going to say, these guys are just talking, man. Why are you putting critical race theory on them? And the thing that I want to say about that is that, sometimes this is why I talked about critical race theory being like the glitter of ideology, because it's everywhere, and then you find it. You think you've gotten rid of it, and you haven't. Once it gets out in the ether, once it gets into our everyday conversation, sometimes we just absorb it, and we don't even realize it. We absorb it, and I'm not out here saying that Truth and Flame are proponents of CRT. What I am saying is, though, as you listen to them talk, it is obvious that whether knowingly or unknowingly, because I haven't ever obviously talked to them personally about these things, they have ingested some of these ideas clearly, right? Why else would it matter whether or not they were in white evangelical churches with European influences? Why would that be the determiner of whether or not they can recognize whether someone is being unjustly treated? That whole, just think about the implications of that. White people can't understand or can't perceive properly when blacks are being mistreated. I have a hard time comprehending that or understanding that. And especially given the fact that where we are now in today's society, where it's not nearly what it was before, you may have been able to make a stronger case for that some time ago. And some people might say, well, if whites were so capable of perceiving justice or injustice some time, on the basis of race, then why did slavery ever happen? And that's a totally different question for a different time. But just know that white people were not unique in that sense, because the ethics of centuries ago were very different. And I think there's some other issues of the moral compass of the masses that are not rooted in skin color, is my point. All right, now let's transition a little bit to these references to liberation theology and black liberation theology. This really caused my ears to perk up, because Truth was saying something to the effect of, oh yeah, there were some people that were on that, but it was demonized. And to be quite frank, I am really, really surprised that the tone of that statement almost suggests that maybe it should not have been demonized. I want to be clear here. Liberation theology has not been taught or explored in any church that I've ever been a part of as a member of a black church for, when I was a kid, again, all the way up to when I was 27. You would rarely hear anything like that, because liberation theology is not orthodox. In other words, it's heresy, right? So this is why it's not like oh, well, it's just, it's kind of another kind of brand or breed of Christianity, kind of like, like Calvinism or Baptist or, Pentecostalism, and then there's liberation theology. No, liberation theology is not like those other things. Okay, so I want to, and this is why, once again, the glitter of CRT, it's only in the context of, I think, where one has started to open themselves up to these ideas that you can even consider liberation theology or black liberation theology to be something of value. Let's get a definition of it, and so you can understand. I think these things are pretty telling.
Is to say it's a reflection on our action in the world, and so it follows a threefold structure of seeing, judging, and acting. Seeing involves the perception of unjust structures that perpetuate material poverty. So to that end, many liberation theologians use Marxist or other critical theories in order to make explicit those.
And there we have it. The first clue that liberation theology is something that we might look at with an eye of suspicion. It's really interesting. He says that oftentimes liberation theologians will use Marxism or critical theory to kind of analyze systems of oppression. And I think in a sense he's understating it. I would say that Marxism and critical theory are the basis and the foundation of liberation theology. It is really a theology of Marxism wrapped in theological and spiritual language, right? Now, you're going to see exactly why I say this. It may not have been exactly evident from this little clip. And there again, this is just a guy I found on YouTube. I thought his definition and his exploration of it was helpful for this discussion. But I wanted to point that out. Let's just listen a little bit more and then we'll jump to something else.
Situation in light of the God who sides with the oppressed. No single person is responsible for systems of oppression like racism or the exploitation of the poor, even though some people may participate in these systems willfully to a greater or lesser extent. However, systems of oppression are bigger than any one person, and so in liberation theology, we have to be able to judge these systems as structural sins that reside not simply in an individual, but in social biases and structural patterns of oppression.
Once again, structural sin. Is that something in the Bible? Does the Bible ascribe sin to systems and structures? You see, the further we go down this hole, the more we move away from orthodoxy, right? And so this is why some of these ideas, and there again, I haven't even, we haven't really even scratched the surface, but he gives us an interesting perspective here. But it's interesting how to listen to people who kind of don't have the hang-ups and who don't kind of see, don't really perceive that, terms like Marxism and critical theory, they don't tend to have the stigma that they have in Christian circles. So they don't have any qualms about just saying what it is, directly, right? So he kind of gives this, I think, very circumspect and I think accurate view of what liberation theology is. Now, we're going to listen to one more gentleman, and then we'll, maybe try to circle back to the Flame and Truth video. But let's listen to one other gentleman, because this guy was, I think, the most transparent and the most telling of all. He's got a video that says how liberation theology saved his life. Okay, let's listen to some of the things he has to say.
The main concept from all these meetings and subsequent books and articles and sermons was the concept that the church had to take a preferential option for the poor because God takes a preferential option for the poor. That's the slogan right there. Preferential option for the poor. God does take sides. and he takes the sides of the poor and the oppressed. And many people would call
It's interesting because I can read in the book of the law, and I'll put the scripture on the screen here, where God says, "You will not pervert justice. You will not show favoritism to the poor, nor partiality to the great." So here you see, interestingly enough, though some of, we talk about God having a heart for the poor, and Jesus said, "I came to preach the gospel to the poor," and absolutely, but God prefers the poor. He even goes as far as to say God never judges the poor. That's a bit rich, right? But you see very quickly how these things, how they almost sound true, and how quickly they go astray here. Let's listen further.
liberation theology, specifically a contextual theology, even though all theology is contextual, but it's especially contextual because it looks at the lives of the poor and the oppressed around them, and out of seeing that arises theology, and therefore also reads the Bible from the perspective of the poor and the oppressed, which isn't that hard to do because the entire thing is written by the poor and the oppressed, and it then sees parallels between their conditions and the poor oppressed today, their conditions. And it especially sees parallels between Jesus, who is a poor working class minority executed by the state, with people who are today poor and working class and under the threat of the state. And then this eventually spread to the United States to eventually formulate Black liberation theology, primarily formulated by James Cone. And he was responding to the oppression of Black people in America and put out a book in 1969 called Black Theology and Black Power. He was trying to find a synthesis between MLK and Malcolm X. And then the last book he released in 2011 before he died in 2018 was this classic, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which sees parallels between the lynching of Black people in America and the crucifixion, and points out Christians who were doing lynchings should have seen the obvious connection. And it's all about showing how God is always in solidarity with people who are oppressed. And then it also led to people like Mary Daly formulating feminist theology, responding to the oppression of women. And then it led to people like Marcella Althius Reed to formulate queer theology, responding to the oppression of LGBTQ people. And so in my spiritual journey of studying theology, philosophy, politics, history, I got to a point where I no longer had any use for the...
Let me just pause right there and just let you appreciate what he just said. Queer theology, feminist theology. This is something, and by the way, I really encourage you to watch that entire video of Neil Shenvi and Razul Berry, because you'll get a very, very thorough understanding of how people who are otherwise orthodox are kind of being overtaken by some of these ideas. But one of the things that Neil mentions in this video and really explores is how in critical theory, they don't see the oppression of people of color and the oppression of LGBTQ people and the oppression of women and all of those things. They don't see them as different things. They see them as one thing. And so in order to be a person who is truly for justice, you have to be about the liberation of queer people and transgender. And you see, and here he says it quite simply, a queer theology, like that's, now we are thoroughly and firmly in the realm of error from a doctrinal standpoint. And there's one last thing that he says that, and we're going to circle back to Flame and Truth because that's really what we're talking about. There's one last thing that he said that I want to just let him kind of point out here for you.
And so through this journey, I now find myself in community with a lot of non-religious leftists because I believe we share a lot of...
Come again?
In community with a lot of non-religious leftists.
Non-religious what now?
Through this journey, I now find myself in community with a lot of non-religious leftists.
And there it is. There it is, friends. He says, I'm a leftist. And this is where it comes full circle. These ideas are ultimately political. They are political ideologies that have very Christianized language and that borrow heavy from Christian concepts of caring for the poor and compassion and the downtrodden, which are obviously biblical concepts. And then there's an old bait and switch. And once again, this gentleman, because he doesn't have the hang up about being labeled a leftist, he just says it plainly, right? It's so many people take offense to that term, but when you have someone who is so able to freely just admit what it is he's about and what it is he's doing, then we don't have to worry about whether or not that term is inherently pejorative. We should be more concerned about whether or not it's an accurate description of the ideas that he holds. And I think that that's an accurate statement. So in closing, let's circle back to Flame and Truth, because that's where we started. And let's listen to one other thing that Flame said that I think is important.
We didn't read books from Christian civil rights leaders.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Because we would have thought that was social gospel. We would have thought that
Yes.
was, or we wouldn't have even been risky enough as a collective to read a social gospel book and try to extract the good from it
Yeah.
and throw away the bones, because we would have been afraid, you know, or.
As you can see, what I just said, there's a lot to be concerned about, and I always find it interesting that we always gotta go to these other areas to try to kind of tease out what God has made plain in His Word. But I don't want to pause too much. Let's listen.
Intimidated or thought it was just a theological deviation from sound doctrine, right? We would have been, you know, and I think that was sort of massaged out of us in the name of God's true priorities, God's true heart and intention.
Not true priorities, not that there's some sort of contradiction between, you know, the priorities that the church has had and God's quote true priorities. It's just that these ideas are not biblical, and that's just the bottom line.
I mean, and I think now it's important to think about, okay, let's call that out. We have to sort of deconstruct that notion,
I agree.
because there's so many people now that are African American that are still sort of entangled in the, like I was perhaps at some point, like many of us, entangled in the just give them the gospel, right? Like that sort of notion of the eternal thing is the most pressing reality.
You know, this is such a strange and interesting caricature. It's like, oh, until we met this Marxist ideology of liberation theology, the church had no idea how to care for and address the temporal needs of people. I don't know. I think it says something in James about, you know, if your brother doesn't have a coat and doesn't have food, how do you love your brother? If you tell him go be warmed and filled and you don't meet his need. I mean, this is like Christianity, like 101 stuff. I mean, I don't want to be too harsh, but I just find this stuff so, I just don't know what he's talking about. All right, let's listen further.
For today's social climate, just abandon ship. Jesus come quick. You know what I mean? And it's like, is that what the Bible is saying, or is that something you learn from another tradition that should be dismissed like the bad of the social gospel? Like that callous, dismissive attitude needs to be dismissed with the same intensity with which you want to dismiss certain things from the social gospel.
All right, and then we'll end it there because that last phrase I think hit me. Let me just summarize what I think we've watched and kind of heard and how I perceive it. I started out at the beginning with Michael Brown. And there's often an accusation of callousness and dismissiveness when really it's an issue of truth. Is it callous and dismissive, for example? Because this is also a tactic of the LGBTQ kind of consortium, or the people who want to forward those agendas. They say it's callous and dismissive to, for example, if a man wants to change his gender to a female, for you to not acknowledge him as such. You're not being kind by misgendering or by refusing to acknowledge the fact that he's transitioned from male to female. And it's a form of emotional blackmail, because it isn't callous and dismissive to hold fast to the truth. Okay? It isn't callous and submissive to say, no, Michael Brown wasn't shot because he's black. He was shot because he attacked a police officer and he wouldn't obey lawful commands. It isn't callous and dismissive to look at the 1,000 people who police shoot every year, about 250 to 300 of which happen to be black, and only 9 to 10 to 15 of, say, maybe a year tend to be unarmed, and we want to act like that's the existential issue of our time. That's not to minimize the 10 or 15 who were shot that are unarmed, and that's, once again, we're granting a lot of caveats here about whether or not unarmed means not dangerous, because case in point, Michael Brown was unarmed, right? He would fall into the category of an unarmed black man, but all the eyewitness testimony said that he was attacking the officer and reached for his gun. But if we grant all of those, we are inverting our society, and we are tearing apart the church over an idea that isn't at all a given to be true. And this is the issue. And this is why I wanted to go down this road, because I love these guys. But this stuff that they're saying is wrong. I know that's just my opinion. What they're saying is wrong. This path that they're going down is wrong. And it's dangerous because it fails to uphold and to orient the compassion and the love that we have with the truth. There has to be that balance. To pretend, and that's the best word I can muster at the moment, that this racial injustice is ubiquitous and everywhere, and we've got to bring our society to a screeching halt until it's addressed, when in fact it's not the issue that you make it to be. You could probably run off without even thinking 20 unarmed black people who were killed in the last 5 or 6 years since Michael Brown was killed, and you couldn't name probably one who was white. But there's probably twice as many white people, or significantly more white people, who have died in similar and the same circumstances, who nobody gives a crap about. And the only reason why, and we're not going here today, we will visit it at another time, but the only reason why people even care, or the reason why we emphasize the black situations or the black victims of these shootings, is because there are people who stand a lot to gain by having the black community believe that the system is after them. So, friends, this video is way longer than I had intended, so I've got to end it here. I'm always interested to hear what you have to say, and please like, share, subscribe, comment on this video, And if you know anyone who you think would benefit from this talk, please, tell them to check me out. Until next time, friends, God bless you.